as we take these activists and others out into the natural world, we look at where nature has itself suffered loss, has itself been harmed, often by us, but also by insects and storms and so forth. We can see how it heals. We can take lessons and inspiration, but wisdom on how we might get through this process. When we take people out and we show them old, dead trees, and I use the word in quotation because nothing is really ever eternally dead in nature. But if we look closely at what foresters call this nurse log, we can see new growth. We can see saplings coming up. We can see moss coming up. The forest will never be the same. We're never going to be the same as a result of climate change. The planet will be forever changed. And yet, in this nurse log, we see how a changed forest, how a changed world can evolve. And that gives us hope and inspiration and guidance for our own journey.
Welcome to the Journey of the Universe 10 Years Later podcast. My name is Sam King, and on today's podcast, we are speaking with Beth Norcross, the founding director of the Center for Spirituality in Nature in Arlington, Virginia. Beth is most at home and at peace in the natural world, where she loves to share her passion and affection for both earth and spirit with others. She regularly speaks, teaches, and writes about the importance of immersion in nature as an essential way to encounter the divine mystery deeply and intimately, and to foster a healthy relationship with Earth. After receiving a BA in mathematics and a Master of Forestry from Duke University, Beth spent the early part of her career working as professional staff for the U.S. Senate National Parks and Forests Subcommittee. After leaving the Senate, Beth worked as Vice President of Conservation for American Rivers, then returned to school to study the interface between ecology and theology at Wesley Theological Seminary. There she completed Master of Theological Studies and Doctor of Ministry degrees, specializing in eco-spirituality. Beth is adjunct faculty at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., where she has developed and taught courses on eco-spirituality and eco-theology. Along with colleagues Laurel Kearns and David Rhodes, Beth co-founded the Green Seminary Initiative, dedicated to infusing care for the earth into theological education. Beth is the author of Inside Out, Practices for Going Deeper in Nature, and Start Singing, How to Form Your Own Spirituality in Nature group. She has written articles and developed educational materials on deepening spirituality through nature, including a video education series through Wesley Seminary, Nature, Our First Way of Knowing God, and a 6-part interactive video course, The Spiritual Wisdom of Trees, Insights from Our Elders, co-written with Leah Rampey and filmed by award-winning filmmaker Jane Pittman, both released in 2021. She also wrote popular Christian and interspiritual study guides to Ken Burns's film, The National Parks, America's Best Idea. When speaking and leading workshops, Beth engages audiences with thoughtful spiritual guidance and specific practices for experiencing firsthand the spaciousness, peace, and healing the natural world offers. Beth, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
We'd love to start by hearing a bit more about your origin story. How did you first become interested in eco-spirituality?
Of course, we're born, aren't we, with that innate connection to the earth that's in our DNA. So my origin story started at my origins, probably. But I think I became aware of this connection. You know, you've been to seminary, you know what happens. We go to seminary, we're, full of vim and vigor and inspiration for doing good work in the world, and then our faith gets deconstructed. And that happened to me as well. It was like one of those 1,000-piece puzzles. All the pieces were strewn out in front of me, and I had no idea how to put it all back together. Couldn't find the edge pieces. There was no picture in the box. And so, what do I do? Where am I faith-wise? Where am I with God or the divine? And I went to see a colleague, a spiritual advisor, and I was frustrated and bereft as we get in these situations. And I said, gosh, this doesn't make sense to me anymore. It doesn't fit together. I don't know where I am. The only time I find myself connected to the divine is when I'm in the natural world. I'm a naturalist. I have an advanced degree in environmental studies. I've always been outside. The only time that I felt some connection is when I'm in nature. And she leaned back, Sam, how they do, and sort of thought and said, so here's an idea for you, Beth. How about go outside? And it was just it wasn't a sort of a parting of the sea moment, but scales sort of fell through my eyes, and I said, this stuff that I was learning in seminary, as important as it is, and I don't want to disparage anyone else's faith journey, but for me, the simplicity of going out into the natural world, feeling connected to other beings, feeling connected to spirit, grounding my faith. It just, that stuff, the contradictions between this passage and that passage, it just didn't matter anymore. And what mattered was this sense of awe and wonder and unity that I felt in the natural world. And so I started doing some programs and leading some walks. I found spiritual practices from other disciplines that I integrated with the spiritual world, with the natural world. And one thing led to another, and I became immersed more and more in spirituality and nature, discovered that many, many others had the same issues and challenges with a more traditional faith structure, and found some friends and some collaborators, and then started this Center for Spirituality and Nature.
Thanks so much for sharing a glimpse into your journey. And I can resonate with some of the tenets of your life path and your deep sense of communion in natural settings. And I think so many people are gravitating toward, solace and spiritual insight from nature. And I know you've written about the experience of the COVID pandemic and how many people found a sense of healing in outdoor spaces when so many indoor spaces were foreclosed to them. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the Center for Spirituality in Nature and what your vision is behind the center and some of the programming you offer.
Well, I appreciate this opportunity. I love talking about the center and our work, but more this sense of the spiritual grounding. I think all major religious traditions are undergirded or actually grounded, literally grounded in a sense of connection with earth. And we've lost some of that in some of our major traditions. So it's encouraging to me to see folks coming back to that. I wanted to, before I talk a little bit about the center, I wanted to mention one other thing that was at play as we were putting this organization together, and that I came out of the environmental community. I was deeply immersed in eco-activism, and there was really good work happening throughout the environmental community. But it felt to me that as we were making intellectual arguments, that we weren't getting to the heart of the matter, the guts of how to make change, how to make transformation. And as I went through seminary, when I got out of seminary, I was first much more involved in what I would describe as faith in action, eco-faith in action and again, doing fabulous work, but it still felt to me that we were in the process of doing, of acting, of even from a moral and ethical standpoint, yet we still hadn't engaged people deeply in a sounds hokey, but in a heart way. We weren't dealing with the emotional aspects and also with relationship. And so what we're finding as we work with the center is that the more that we fall back in love with the natural world, the more that we see it and relate to it, the more we want to make the kinds of changes that we're all invested in. We want to put up solar panels. We want to drive differently. We want to plant native plants because our beloved is being affected by our behaviors. And so it was with that in mind that we began the Center for Spirituality and Nature. It began with just me doing some walks here and there. And we have a staff of 3 and some contractors now. We have our programs, our individual deepening programs that can be the class that you mentioned earlier on the spiritual wisdom of trees. We have Monday Notes from Nature, which is a quote and a poignant picture that center us for the week. I run a number of different programs, both locally and nationally. We do hybrid what we call inside out programs, online and in person. We also have a very robust program that we've reinvigorated lately, our Spirituality in Nature group program. This encourages people to come back to nature, to recenter themselves, but in human community, and then broaden that community to understand that it involves all the critters and creatures of the earth. And we have, I think, something like 25 or 30 of these spirituality and nature groups forming. We actually have a training session coming up in March 11th on our website. I'm sure you'll be providing that information. So we're doing individual deepening and deepening in community, not just the human community, but the broader community as well. That was a very long answer to your question.
Well, it's great. And I'm so glad you pointed to the spiritual wellsprings of ecological activism and the importance of sustaining this heart-centered approach to ecological and social transformation, because I think that so often gets overlooked in activist circles, and people burn out if they don't have that deeper affective or spiritual wellspring to draw upon. I think about Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., some of these great civil rights leaders of the 20th century, and how they drew profoundly on their faith to galvanize, social and environmental change. So I think it's, so inspiring that you're making that linkage for people. And
actually, this year in particular, we're doing more and more work at this intersection of spirituality and action, particularly as it pertains to climate change. And we have a program that's developing on that. I think that, first of all, it's difficult work, climate activism is, and it's full of challenges, but also a great deal of sorrow and lament and some guilt. And so what do we do with those tough feelings? And what better place to bring them to, but to the earth itself? And of course, burnout is such a challenge with this work. And so we can take this into the natural world for inspiration, for comfort, and for renewal. And one of the things that I love to do as a naturalist and as a spiritual leader and teacher is to learn from nature itself. And so as we take these activists and others out into the natural world, we look at where nature has itself suffered loss, has itself been harmed, often by us, but also by insects and storms and so forth. we can see how it heals. We can take lessons and inspiration, but wisdom on how we might get through this process, how we might heal, how we might engage. And if you'll indulge me, a small example, I know Yale does a lot of work in the forestry school also. When we take people out and we show them old dead trees, and I use the word in quotation because nothing is really ever eternally dead in nature, but the tree is no longer living as we know it. It's on the ground, big old tree, was important to the ecosystem. Of course, there's grief and sorrow. But if we look closely at what foresters call this nurse log, we can see new growth. We can see saplings coming up. We can see moss coming up. The forest will never be the same. We're never going to be the same as a result of climate change. The planet will be forever changed. And yet, in this nurse log, we see how a changed forest, how a changed world can evolve. And that gives us hope and inspiration and guidance for our own journey. You got me going now, Sam.
Absolutely. I love it. I mean, it's so inspiring, and to, connect our own existential path with the patterns we're seeing in nature. And, I read one of your articles about how, for an osprey, an eagle wears the face of destruction, taking a baby osprey from its nest. But in that process, the eagle is feeding her progeny, right? And so life is inevitably emerging from destruction. And that's, another pattern we try to explore with the Journey of the Universe project, is to see that sense of renewal, that resurrection process in nature, and how can that catalyze our own sensibilities as activists, to, as you're saying, to make space for lament and grief and breakdown and metabolize that into renewal. Are there any other practices that you have found effective in working with groups in deepening their connection to the natural world?
Well, there's so many different practices, and I would say that we start, as any spiritual guide would, and in listening to where that individual or that group is. So there's so many different ways that we can approach them. I'm adjunct at a Christian seminary, and we can approach it through scripture. And because as I would tell the students, we're not making this up, it's in the book, really, it's in the book. But for someone who doesn't come from that tradition or comes from another tradition, we might approach it differently, and those practices might look different. We did put together a book a few years ago called Inside Out that has 50 spiritual practices that can be done in nature. We have on our website several hints to developing a regular spiritual practice in nature. I might mention just a couple of examples of practices that we found over and over and over again to be helpful, regardless of your tradition. The first is to simply use our senses, but use them one by one. We found now, neuroscientists tell us that we really can't multitask, that we toggle from one thing to the other. And in our senses, in the same way, when we approach a forest or an ocean or a desert, we're toggling between sight and our sense of hearing and our sense of touch. And so by turning off all the senses except for the one that you're focusing on, it can be a very powerful, focused engagement with the natural world. And I encourage people to do this either individually, or you can do it in groups where each part of the group takes one sense. And then at the end, we have a communal experience of that piece of the environment. I think all of these practices are pointing toward seeing, really seeing. I think it was John Seed who famously said, we can't save what we can't love. I would go one step further that says we can't love what we don't see, that we don't listen to, that we don't engage with. And this senses practice really focuses in again, I would use this word beloved. What are you saying to me? What are you saying? How do I see you? How do I see you? And the one that I really love to use is our sense of smell is really not very well developed. But how do you smell? How do you smell? And just invites folks into relationship. Another practice that actually I'm going to use this coming up Saturday, if anybody happens to be in the area, we're doing a walk, on a winter walk, embracing winter. What does it mean to embrace the literal winter, but also our spiritual winters? We all have them. We might collectively be going through one right now. That program is this Saturday in DC and also in LA, but we have a new aspect of this where we are putting out self-guided programs. So we've had many people purchase our self-guided walk, which I would encourage. But this weekend, I'm going to be using one of my favorite practices, and that is to write a haiku. And one of the things that we like to yak. Or if we're not yakking, we're yakking to ourselves. And I'm yakking a lot here today to you too. But the haiku, by doing that 5-syllable, 7-syllable, 5-syllable, really being constrained by that structure, it forces us to stop blathering and to go inward. To go from here from a book to an essay to a poem to a haiku. And it encourages us, I should say, to go deep. So we go out into nature, we center ourselves, we breathe with nature. What's coming up for us? What's coming up? We might find something in the natural world that's attracting us, who's saying, hey, pay attention to me. What's coming up, and how would you describe that in a haiku form? So those are just a couple. We have 48 more in the book, that lots and lots of different ways, simple ways, complicated ways of engaging with the natural world spiritually.
I really admire how you're engaging all these different senses and ways of knowing, the many forms of intelligence and attunement that we have, right? Because, as you see from your work, appealing only to the cognitive analytical layer of us, can only motivate so much change, right? We're seeing more and more the need for both knowledge production and also just a source of motivation that is embodied and heart-centered and engages our senses. And we need all these modes of knowing to catalyze the environmental changes we need, right? When I think about Thomas Berry's idea of the reinvention of the human at the species level, right? And that can't just occur in this theoretical cognitive part of ourselves, right? We need to feel that in our pores. And
yes, I've been quite influenced by Thomas Berry's work, and I know Yale's programs have been as well, certainly through the work of Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. And if I might take a personal moment in here, since their names came up, I am so very grateful to both of them for their work in the world and the way they work in the world. They have been mentors and friends of mine, and the center have supported this work in so many different ways. And I owe them an extraordinary debt of gratitude. And I really just wanted to make sure that we touched on that today, Sam. So thank you for this moment of personal privilege.
Of course, yes. And Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm have been incredible mentors to so many in this path of religion and ecology, both in the field and the engaged force of carrying out this fusion of science and spirituality to address and catalyze change to, address the greatest challenges of our time. I thought we would pivot a little bit to talk about video education, multimedia, because that's something that we really hold up with the Journey of the Universe project as a multimedia project, telling the epic story of cosmic evolution through this film and book and podcast series, and to think about the ways that video and imagery and sound can make ideas really come alive and resonate. And I'm curious how you have found working with multimedia and how the use of video, for instance, has added a new sense of depth to your work.
Well, of course, at Journey, you are the exemplar of how to use those. You were way ahead of the game in terms of using video and digital resources. And it's a story for both Journey and for spirituality, or Center for Spirituality and Nature, that tells visually, or it can tell visually. My strong inclination is to be with people outdoors. That's my my sweet spot, as they say. But we inched into this prior to the pandemic, and like so many, this word pivot, I don't think we've never used it so much as we've used it in the last few years, but people were really hurting economically, but also hurting spiritually. And so we very quickly moved into what I would describe as hybrid programs, where we used Zoom and we used video, and we moved into this space because we had to, and found it to be a very rich experience for people. For example, in our hybrid programs, we would call them inside out programs, where we would have a program as we would normally have outdoors, but I would do the introductory materials as I'm talking to you right now. And then we'd send people off into their backyard to do spiritual practices. And just as a note, I'll come back to your question, what a great place to do spiritual exercises, but your own backyard. We go off to Yosemite and Yellowstone and so forth to find, that magical place when it could be right behind us. So we would send people off, and they would come back, and then we'd have a conversation. And that turned it into just an extremely rich collaboration. And then we moved, I think you mentioned our first foray. We're a very small organization, and we relied on a filmmaker of some note, who happens to be a colleague and a dear friend, and she volunteered to film this spiritual wisdom of trees for us and with us outside. And we've now offered that to 300 or 400 people, I guess, and we're offering it again now. And I think part of it, Sam, is access. It's an expansion that a film or a video or even this conversation can reach so many more people than we could possibly reach person to person. But beyond that, as you suggested in your question, there is something about the video itself that opens people up and brings people in to this conversation. I was reading a book recently by Frederick Buechner called The Remarkable Ordinary. In it, he was talking about how art frames experience. There is so much noise and so much visual information that we're getting, that what a film, I think, can do, as a great art of work can do, is it can put a frame around it and say, okay, just pay attention here. And actually, I'm trying a spiritual exercise this Saturday that's playing with this idea of framing. And so a visual resource like Journey, like our Spiritual Wisdom of Trees and others, can put a boundary around something and then encourage us to work within that within that structure. And of course, it's visually very pleasing, a good film is. And certainly Journey is that. And we'll talk about that in a second, what it's meant to us and to me. But I think I hadn't really thought about it till you asked that question, but I think that's one of the values of video, that it puts some boundaries. It contains the message in a beautiful format, so that we can handle it, so that we can deal with it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a profound point about how art, by kind of circumscribing or putting boundaries on reality, can open up this whole world of possibilities and this framing. It's almost like an object of meditation, a locus of meditative awareness, to evoke some kind of sensibility.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was also really struck by this sense of re-enchantment of our own bioregions, of not seeing nature as a national park or this demarcated place out there, but right here, and finding that sense of awe and wonder in our backyards or wherever we reside, I think is such a powerful message to be conveying to people.
We like to use we have a program that we run on pilgrimage to your own backyard. And so I have a friend and colleague, Leah Rampey, who leads pilgrimages to Iona, has done for many years. And you'll get no argument from me that Iona is a very thin place, this one of these liminal spaces where the divine seems to be more present. And so I challenged her to use that same pilgrimage principle in our own ecosystem here in the Potomac River. And she and I have been teaching this class now, Pilgrimage in Your Own Backyard. And it's been a marvelous experience. I mean, Sam, what if we, I don't know, I'm a big national park person, and I go and I study and I read all the signs and I read a lot of books. What if we did the same thing in our own ecosystem, really got to know it and came into it with the same sense of awe and wonder? I mean, you might have to dig around a little bit here in Arlington, Virginia, but it's back there. There's never a day that goes by, and we've lived here almost 30 years, that there isn't something exceptional that really catches my eye. So yes, thank you. I love that concept of looking. It's a sort of an extension of looking inward, isn't it? We look inward. But part of this is our community. This is our family. It starts right here. Yeah.
Absolutely. And through forging those relationships, I have a beautiful linden tree in our backyard here in New Haven, Connecticut.
Ah, lovely.
And this tree must be over 100 years old, with roots that extend, tens of meters in every direction. And it's remarkable to see how this tree changes through the seasons, how the different animals that reside in this tree come and go in different parts of the year. And it comes back to Thomas Berry's idea that every living being is telling its own story. Perhaps every being generally is telling its own story and encodes memory within. And really, I think, as you're saying, attuning ourselves to those stories and really being able to help evoke them through relationship is so pivotal. And you touched on the influence of Journey of the Universe. And I'm curious to hear from you a little bit more about how the universe story and how this context of deep time has inspired and given energy to the work you're doing, the Center for Spirituality and Nature.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this. I was at the AAR SBL meeting many years ago when Barry Evelyn and John and Brian, I guess, was there too, although I can't recall. debuted this film, and it was really quite universe altering, if you will. I have been thinking about this since I knew we were going to chat, and I thought, how could I explain how I felt that it turned things? And I was thinking about a kaleidoscope, and it felt to me, or it has felt to me for a while, that our kaleidoscope that perceives the world and perceives how the world was created and so forth, could feel a little bit stuck. And that story, that kaleidoscope, that view that we were looking through, still speaks to many, many people. And I don't want to disparage that. But for many others, that view, as pretty as it was, felt a little constrained. And it was getting a little bit worn. And like my puzzle wasn't making as much sense anymore. And it felt to me, in reflecting back, is that what Journey did was it shifted the kaleidoscope. Do you know what I mean? When you look through a kaleidoscope and you shift, and the pieces of glass all start to change, and a new sort of view comes in mind. And at first you're very disoriented because you're like, whoa, what's that? What's this? But then you start to notice the different colors and textures, and just a completely new view, a completely fresh view of the creation story, of deep time, and deep space, and so forth. I don't know, I think I just got gesticulating, and I'll lower my hand. So I was doing my kaleidoscope. So it feels to me that for those of us who are treading new ground, although I would suggest that this is very old ground, because this was really our ancestors' very first way. And I might argue that Journey is coming back in many ways to a more grounded place, a place more akin to our ancestors. So Journey opened up a lot of space for those of us who are moving in new old directions to find a place. It was permission giving, and it was also, of course, inspiring and view changing.
Absolutely. That image resonates a lot with me. And I couldn't help but think of Plato's allegory of the cave, where, a group of prisoners are chained together in a cave, and one of them is unshackled and moves toward the sun outside the cave, and his eyes are in pain. And when he sees the reality outside the cave, he can't believe their reality, right? It's this like disturbance. It's shaking up this kaleidoscope, right? And then ultimately the person sees the reality of these objects outside the cave, and then comes back into the cave to try to educate the others. And I think that image is helpful just for any sense of worldview transformation, right? Because anytime we encounter a new worldview or just emergent insights about the nature of reality, our minds are disturbed or expanded, and there's a sense
disoriented
of
at the least.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so it's really inspiring for me to hear your sense of reorientation, and to sort of be creating this new bridge between theology and cosmology and ecology. And I can think about a book I read in graduate school, When God Was a Bird, by Mark Wallace.
Yes,
it's about it's about the animistic character of the Bible and God's entanglement with the more than human world, with Moses in the burning bush, or arresting Job in a whirlwind, landing as a dove on Jesus's shoulder, all these incarnational images that are bound up with the more than human community of life. And, even just reading that book shifted my whole perspective on the Bible, for instance. And
it's a beautiful book, isn't it?
it really is.
Yeah,
really
he's
is.
done some wonderful work on Christian animism.
Yeah, and just creating those bridges, right, between theology and cosmology, between scripture and animism and ecology. So yeah, just wanted to express my own resonance with what you're sharing about this kind of integral worldview of bridging between these traditional ways of seeing and emerging insights, brought forth by Journey of the Universe, for instance. And I think that you're mentioning that in many ways this is an ancient worldview, this sense of deep connection to our cosmic home, right? And this primal encounter with the stars and with the elements that formed life, really rekindling that for people, I just find so profound.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Mark Wallace's work and his book, and I just wanted to say that we can, even though that kaleidoscope shifted for me, if we can go back into that view that we were a little bit stuck in, and we can see it with new eyes. And back to what I was saying before, when we talked to our students about how it's all in the book, I mean, Mark makes the point, God was in fact a bird. I mean, he didn't make that up. It's in the book. It's in the book. And I like to talk to groups about the burning bush because, we talk about an origin story. I mean, it's the great I am comes to Moses, in a shrub. And so we're so used to hearing that story, we forget the impact and the import of the bush. I mean, nature becomes sort of a backdrop, if you will. It becomes utilitarian and if we're not careful with that story. And it, a means to an end, a vehicle, and as opposed to an integral part of the story. God's in the bush. Yes, God is in the bush. And in the stars and in the ground and the rock and everything else. And so I think there's a danger in there and an opportunity for us to go back and look at these stories and go, oh yeah, there's a bush in that story. What's that about? So I just wanted to get that in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you're talking about that sense of intrinsic value and bringing us beyond a utilitarian, instrumental way of engaging nature into an intrinsic sense of the sacred, the intrinsic dignity of natural phenomena, right? And really letting that perspective seep into our beings, right? There's so much talk about ecosystem services, right? Or quantifying nature for human use, even in conservation circles. But I think you're bringing forth such an important perspective about the inherent sanctity and dignity of every part of the Earth community.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So as we come to a close here, Beth, I wanted to...
Are we closing? This has been so much fun.
I know we could talk for days. My goodness. But as we kind of reach the last part of our interview, I wanted to ask if you had any parting message or idea that you wanted to share with the Journey of the Universe community, which is an expanding global community of folks inspired by this film and multimedia project and who are looking for some kind of direction or inspiration with regard to the environmental crises we're facing. So, is there any message you'd like to share with our community?
Well, I so appreciate that opportunity. I think that I've gotten to some of that already in our conversation. I think that one thing that I that I might mention, and that is that when we are deeply immersed in the natural world, there's a humility that comes if we're, because we so understand that we are just a tiny little piece of the puzzle. Back to puzzles again, the theme today. But we're a little tiny piece of this inextricably linked and connected web. And as we go humbly into nature, there is an opportunity for us to ask the natural world itself for guidance, or ask spirit for guidance, or ask God, however, whatever your construction, wherever that kaleidoscope is for you, to guide us through this. Because we're one of the challenges of activists, especially climate activists, is the clock is ticking and we need to move. And so that taking that time to recenter ourselves into the natural world can feel like wasted time. But in fact, one of my concerns, respectfully, of our environmental efforts is that we might be running off, unless we take the time to center ourselves in spirit, in earth, that we run the danger of exercising the same hubris that got us into this mess in the first place. So if I had a final message, it's worth the time, it's worth the effort to sink back into the natural world. And it's all around us. If we live in Manhattan, if we live in Missoula, it's all here. All we have to do is look, take a moment, take a breath, take a step, take a breath, take a step, and re-immerse ourselves, asking for guidance, so that we don't run the danger of, out of our sense of urgency, going off in a direction that may not be sustaining.
Wonderful. So grateful for that message of centering to round out our discussion, Beth. I've learned so much from you today, and I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to chat with us and for all the amazing work you're doing in eco-spirituality. So thank you again. I look forward to supporting your work in the future.
Well, I've so enjoyed our conversation. I've made a few mental notes. I've learned a lot from you too, Sam, and I love the way you put some things down. If I could just remember, I'm going to write them down when we're finished.
It's mutual. Thank you so much, and I look forward to
Thank you, Sam. Thanks.